because the time is allotted to us, has to be strictly adhered to. So thank you very much for your interest in this subject of literary study.
Sorry for the interruption. I'm requesting that for all the panelists who will be making presentations, kindly enable your video if possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm sorry, I do not have the bio for Mr. Valentumye right now. So I'm going to ask Mr. Valentumye Michael or Dr. Valentumye Michael to introduce
Mr.
Yes, please introduce yourself to us and then deliver your paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good morning, people who are attending. I'm very glad to be here. It's such a golden opportunity. My name is Michael Valentumye. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Okay,
and I teach in Moon University, where I teach literature, but I'm also a PhD student at Bishop Stewart University, and I'm here to present a paper. I'll go straight away. I wanted to just be guided on how much time we are allowed.
The session chair has arrived, so we want to thank you, Eve. Please let's pass controls to Isaac to take on from here. Isaac, please.
Thank you, Eve, for standing in for the minutes I've been away, and welcome everyone. My name is Isaac. I teach in the Department of Literature at Makerere University, and yes, I welcome you to this session, and I look forward to hearing from all of us. So we're going to have 4 papers. One is by Michael Valentumye, a friend of mine, and we've been to the same classroom. Glad to see you, Michael, again. My colleague Eve Navulia, who is a lecturer in the Department of Literature at Makerere University. And Stella, good to see you. Stella is a PhD student in the Department of Literature. And we are also going to be joined by Kansime Dose. He's very much around. I think he's joining, and he should be able to join us in a few. So we would like to start with Michael, whose paper is entitled Projecting a Future Already in Place in Ochunyo's Fate and Footprints. Thank you, Michael. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I want to start. The title is Projecting a Future Already in Place in Julius Ochunyo's Fate of the Banished and Footprints of the Outsider. Could you tell me, Isaac, how much time I'm allowed?
You are allowed 10 minutes maximum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will go straight away to the paper. This paper is developed as part of an ongoing PhD course at Bishop Stewart University, where I'm undertaking a structured study of the novels of Julius Ochunyo, Jennifer Nansuvu Kamakumbi, and Moses Isegawa. And in those novels, I'm studying time. Narrative temporality or time is perhaps the area in which there's still a great degree of agreement among the theorists. The major framework in the study of time in novels has been Gerard Genet's tripartite schema of order, duration, and frequency, as discussed by several authors. In this paper is an effort in studying narrative ordering, which is rudimentarily defined as the opposition between the time of the narrative and narrative time. It is from that angle that I talk about prolepsis. Of course, I'm using that prolepsis to reflect the idea of projecting a future already in place. Janet uses prolepsis to imply anticipation. Prolepsis is the telling of a future before its time. That's according to Fanon. It conveys the idea of preconception or anticipation, or a narrative maneuver that consists of narrating or evoking in advance events that will take place later. In novels, projection is for a future already in place. Since such a future was already conceived by the author long ago, crafted, and lies in wait for the reader to discover. There is general consensus among the narrative theorists that within the novelistic tradition, prolepsis are much less common than analepsis or flashbacks. Prolepsis has received relatively less attention among the narrative theorists in general and the African scholars today. I must mention generally structuralism has received less attention in African novelistic scholarships. Moreover, many scholars argue that it's the first-person narratives that are able to lend themselves better to the use of prolepsis. I agree that that assertion may be true, but it should not go to mean that the third-person narratives deploy prolepsis less and less effectively whenever they're used. That could also explain my choice of Wachinyo's books, both of which are written in the third person. Allow me also to differentiate between anticipation or prolepsis and preparation, because there are cases where narratives hint to the future, but in fact, they do not skip any step and jump into the future. In preparation, there's some kind of hint at the future, but it's always learned in retrospect after we have read and covered a certain part of the book. However, in the prolepsis, the reader is confronted with the future before its time. There's some kind of skip in time. I quote here the first page of Fate of the Banished that reads, "The priest lay on bed, spread eagle on his back. Dark red blood from his punctured heart had oozed down his narrow chest and over the plateau of his belly," and goes on and goes on. But of course, as we know, this is an ending event that really needs other events to have happened before it can take place. And my argument is that the prolepsis is that here the chronological order of a story event is disturbed and the narrator narrates future events out of turn. I have used the discursal perspective of narratology. Now, discursal narratology basically analyzes stylistic choices that determine the form and rendering of a narrative. Specifically, I have adopted Gerard Genetti's narrative theory as written in the Narrative Discourse and Essay Methods. Genetti's typology offers the foundation of the discussion of prolepsis in the Wachinyan novel. Genetti gives us a framework in which to study prolepsis. He looks at prolepsis at three levels: the external, the internal, and also the mixed. But within the internal, there's also the heterodiegetic, the homodiegetic, and within the homodiegetic again, there is the completive, repetitive, and under the completive, there's also the one that is iterative. This is how I have approached the paper, and this is how I've discussed prolepsis. This is an interpretivist research, with all the characteristics of interpretism, the relativist ontology, and the subjectivist epistemology, and is dominantly using qualitative methodology. The research basically used documentary analysis method. Documents are interpreted here by the researcher to give voice and meaning around the assessment topic, which is time, or for that matter, prolepsis, within the books of Wachinyo. Accordingly, the novels under study were subjected to a documentary analysis guide, where they were analyzed for specific aspects of prolepsis. The research also consulted different books, journals, reports, and other periodicals, and together I made my opinion about prolepsis in Wachinyo. I'll start with prolepsis that is of the external type. This prolepsis takes place after the end of the first narrative. And I'm treating the first narrative as the story that is covered within the novel. Here, so what I'm describing as, what is described as external prolepsis will start at the end of the narrative that is supposed to be the first narrative. Like in the case of Fate of the Banished, we know that up to the death of Dila, after the death of Flo, we are working within the first narrative. Any event thereafter can be treated as external. Genetti has observed that external prolepsis mostly function as epilogues, and they help us to continue one or another line of action up to its logical conclusion. In Fate of the Banished, the tableau of the Dawa murder, of course, of Flo and the dealer, is incomplete without the novel's epilogue. We wait on the epilogue to pursue the story to the logical conclusion. Naturally, in the epilogue, we learn about the age of Apire, the place of birth, that's Atari village, and in East Pataka. The real reason why Dila and Flo dies, of course, they were shot, but the epilogue is quite categorical. It says they died because of extensive damage to internal organs as well as hemorrhage. So the external prolepsis will help us to complete what wasn't completed within the course of the novel. But there are also cases when the external prolepsis is depicted in the narrator's present, and you read a statement that may read like it's within the story, but it's actually dealing with something that is an after story. This is how Footprints of the Outsider opens, and I'm quoting the second paragraph. This is largely the story of Abdul Wheat, who might be a member of parliament now or who might not. And of course, when you see who might be a member of parliament now or might not, we're already aware that at the end of Footprints, there's a contest that never gets resolved. So the idea of whether Olwit is a member of parliament or is not a member of parliament is actually outside the first narrative, and thus constitutes this kind of prolepsis. And when the author states like that, he helps us to, we as readers, because readers are driven forward by the hope that they'll complete the book, it helps us to enumerate the role that Olwit will play in the novel, but also the crux of the events as being that contest that will not get accomplished. I see similar examples in Fate. I quote here on page 113 where Apiri says, "Shall I ever have another chance to set eyes on you, mother, and you, Betty, you and your diffident, even shy husband? Shall I ever have a chance to set my eyes on you, Achai?" Of course, we know that in the course of the novel, this never happens. But this is the way that Ochinyo resolves this whole thing of the family. If these people will meet Appear again, it will be in prison and it will be after the story and also be treated as external. I note here that such proleptic thrusts are a poignant testimony of the omnitemporality of the remembering conscience. I move to prolepsis that are internal in nature, and amongst these I'm starting with the heterodiegetic prolepsis. And heterodiegetic prolepsis narrate ahead of time the story of another character or event. Such character or event is normally off-scene at the time of the heterodiegetic proleptic thrust. In Fate, for example, the evocation approps of Flu's dream about Flo and the sun, you know, when they're sailing on a boat and they suffer that accident and scrapes is heterodiegetic. It appears in a form of dream. Now, many scholars have already noted that dreams generally are literature-like, and literature is also dream-like. And I've noted that Ochinyo generally delivers the heterodiegetic prolepsis in Fate in form of dreams. And you see that this dream that Pulu endures helps us to learn that maybe sooner than later, Flo will also die. I also want to observe that there's a conversation between Awal, Chief Awal, the father of Mike Adole Awal, when Awal is just a teenager in high school. And in that conversation, the resting point is that he let Awal study hard. The whites may not go today or tomorrow, but eventually when they go, Awal will take over. The likes of the Awals will take over. And we're not surprised that 1 year to independence, Awal becomes a member of parliament for Aya constituency. I observe that the anticipatory terms of this type answer in advance the character's motivation for action. They also offset future ellipses in cases where you find novels with ellipses, or sometimes parallipsis in case a part of the story is told and another part is not told. I moved on to the second category of internal prolepsis, and those are the homodiegetic prolepsis. But as I mentioned in the framework, they are either completive or repetitive. Now, completive prolepsis fill ahead of time a later blank.
Michael, you have 1 minute.
Oh, surprising. They fill ahead of time a later blank. And we see in the case of Ochinyo, the way he begins his novels, he will always create that kind of ellipsis. When you see the way Fate of the Banished is began, it began at the very climax, you know, and in the process, Ochinyo contests the linearity of time or cosmological time in preference for phenomenological time, hence creating some kind of perpetual present. You're moving forward, but you already know the result, you know. And as we see in that kind of passage, we know that what is present as we are reading now is past in the sense of the writer, but we as readers are pushed forward to find out exactly how things happened. I say that there are also other completive prolepses that are iterative in nature. I may not elaborate them because of time, but the iteration is here we say that such prolepsis mention in advance several portions of later events that are taken as if they were alike and for that matter repetitive. The last category are those prolepses that are repetitive in nature. and repeating prolepsis is still ahead of time double, however slightly, a narrative section to come. And we see this kind of thing happening a lot. Dealer dreams when he's sleeping with Flo, and that happens. Arab dreams when they're taking away his cattle.
Michael, please close up. Michael, please conclude.
I really want to conclude by saying that we have been able to go through anticipation or prolepsis in the novel with these categories. Time hasn't allowed me to elaborate as I would have wished, but I really want to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this presentation on the future and Ugandan literature. I would like us to move ahead and invite Dr. Eve Nabulia, who is going to present to us a paper entitled Once Upon a Time, Dialogical Imaginations of the Natural Environment in Ganda Folktales. Dr. Nabulia, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Can I share my screen? Could you stop sharing the screen?
Yes, you can share your screen. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for taking interest in this presentation and in your presence. We thank you. This paper draws attention to the contemporary relevance of yesterday's folk tales. It features an eco-critical reading of selected Ganda folk tales, guided by Mikhail Bakhtini's notion of dialogism. The paper is based on a postdoctoral study sponsored by Andrew Mellon and managed here in the humanities at Makerere University. And the stories in focus were documented from the communities in PG, Gomba, and Komansimbi, which were organized under a Kyoto program of the Central Broadcasting Corporation. And this is a radio station run by the Uganda Kingdom. So what is the folktale? It's a traditional mode of education and entertainment, and it's still alive today in many rural communities. In town here, we assume it is dead. And stories, sometimes there are stories passed down from earlier generations, but also, there are also other stories that are composed in the contemporary time. The stories usually utilize the natural landscape as a backdrop in relating human experiences and on Earth. So why should we now be interested in this seemingly outdated artistic form? From an eco-critical point of view, by studying the representations of the landscape in the folktales and comparing them or the images with our landscape, the topography, vegetation, animal life, etc., we get a sense of the extent to which the present generation has destroyed the natural environment. So Mikhail Bakhtin advanced and approached the study of art based on the dialogical nature of language. For him, all art derives from human experience, but at the same time, it informs lived experience and should be seen to improve life. The ideas embedded in the imaginary events in artistic works, apart from defining what it means to be human, reveal real human problems and also gesture towards real solutions. Thus, in this function, art contributes greatly to science, even as we know it today. And Bakhtin, according to Bakhtin, believes that art has eternal relevance. One of Bakhtin's observations is that I find important in our time is that art or works of art actually come to full age or reveal the full extent of the wealth of knowledge embedded therein after centuries. And he makes that remark that trying to understand and explain a work of art, in terms of the conditions of its epoch alone, will limit us, the kind of insight we draw from it. So to demonstrate these ideas of Bakhtin, we are going to use 3 folk tales. One of the folk tales has to do with the forest, and it's called Mabungo. in this folktale, the narrator describes a forest and begins this way. Awo lwatuukanga mbalabira nga wabaawo omusajja gwe bayita Nanjwengi eyabeeranga e Mabungo. Omutalo ogwo gukutte ku kibira kinene bwaguuga omwali ebibala ebya buli ngeri. Ebibala bino byasikirizanga nnyo abaana okugenda ku luzzi olwalinga ku njegoyego zaakyo, and so on and so forth. And in the English version, you could simply take it that there was a huge forest, and there was this person called Nanjwenge who lives in a village next to this forest. And in the whole story as it unfolds, there is famine and the family cannot have enough food. The whole community actually eventually depends on the forest to eat. But what happens is that there's a taboo associated with the forest. So if you pick more than one fruit, then you disappear or you get punished in some kind of way. So there's a mysterious power that seems to be guiding this forest and controlling the harvesting of fruits. So Nanjenge's children harvest much more than one type of fruit at one time, and they actually lose their way home. They never come back home, and later people see them as monkeys. I mean, they turn into monkeys, flying and eating, flying from one tree to another and eating fruits in the forest. So those, it's believed, were the first monkeys. They violated the taboo and harvested more fruits than was supposed. Now, in this folktale, we see that the village derives its name from one of the fruits in the forest, which was said to be Mabungo. And that also, in a way, points to the fact that the forest is actually, this community that we are talking about, in a way, is encroaching on the forest. So it's like a forest community. Otherwise, the village, I mean, the village entirely depends on the forest, and they are part of the forest. So Mabungo being the most common fruit in this forest village, the village takes place, I mean, the village takes its name from there. Now, in this folktale also, it is clear that the resources in the forest are actually very useful in sustaining human life during a famine. But then you wonder, why is there a famine? The storyteller doesn't tell us why at this particular time there is a famine. But what I want to draw our attention to is the representation of the forest itself, the way it is told to us, the way it looks. This forest has many fruits in it, and it's dense, and it's looks like it is virgin, it's untouched by human deforestation and related activities. When we compare that to what the kind of forest that we have, for instance, our Mabida, the image is very different. Tugume and Nyakojo 2020 write about Mabida forest and the forest plants and fruits in there, and their research revealed that many of the fruits that were in Mabida actually are now extinct because of human activity going on in that forest. So this story therefore helps us to look back to see how far or how much of our forests we have lost, because it presents to us the pristine forest and how it is expected to be. Another story that I study in this paper is called Balibuzani Forest. Balibuzani Amira Lukuluwasi. It's like the forest by Buzani actually swallows Lukuluwasi, which is the name of a person.
Yenem, you have 1 minute.
Oh my God. Okay, so
yes.
In this, I don't know what to do. Anyway, so what we see, there's another story that I look at is also Zinzara, which is called Parity Mountain. And under this, I look at the way the mountain is looked at as a source of life and as a sustainer of life. And it has many herbs that people come and pick and have their remedies to various diseases. So what we see in this mountain, in the mountain and the forests that are featured in the folk tales, instructors, imply one thing, that the mountains or the forests are associated with a mysterious life-giving power and productivity. But the wealth multiplication in these forests or mountains do not emanate from human destructive activity. You do not have to cut down the trees or to destroy the forest for you to be able to get wealth from it, but instead you need to actually retain it. That's what we see coming out through the representations of the landscape and topographical features in the stories that I study. And so in conclusion, Southern Ghana folktales actually do offer a glimpse into the traditional wisdom on sustainability, and they also provide insight on possible solutions for environmental problems today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eve Navolia, for your presentation on Ganda folktales. Would like to move over to Stella, whose presentation is entitled Marriage, Love and Sacrifice, Exploring Women's Experiences in Marriage. Stella, you're welcome to make your presentation. You have 10 minutes from now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I am Stella, the Department of Literature, Macquarie University. And I'm presenting on, as the Chair mentioned, Marriage, Love, Sacrifice, Exploring Women's Experiences in Marriage. So most often the Greek and Roman civilizations have been used as a source of moral and literary inspiration for contemporary cultures, especially Africa. I argue to the contrary by using the Greek and Ghanaian literary works to state that in marriage, the classics as a yardstick for modern cultures and contemporary debate is not feasible, and that Africa can rely on its past to address gender inequalities. I'm working with 6 plays, 3 of the Greek by Euripides and 3 Ghanaian playwrights, and liberal and African feminism Guideline Analysis. Greek marriages were monogamous, but the husband could seek sexual pleasures even within the home and outside the home. And the Akan marriages are polygamous, but the play depicted them as monogamous, and the man had the customary right to marry as many as he pleases. However, he must pacify his wife, and the junior wife or the new wife must also give the senior wife a gift of acceptance before the man can go ahead and marry another. When you compare these two, you realize that it is hypocritical for the Athenians to practice monogamy when their society was highly polygamous with very little respect for the wife, unlike the Akan system that practiced polygamy, but the wife's position is secured and mostly respected. In both societies, marriage is the end game for the woman. It was important, and girls were frowned on, unmarried girls were frowned upon, and there's always a constant reminder for them to get married. In Athens, girls married between the ages of 14 and 16 to older men. So if you are 18 years, then you've passed the age of marriage, and you might not be able to get the husband you require. This disparity in age has effect on the girl and the marriage. So the first is that there's complete dependency of the girl on the husband. Because she's young, she now sees the girl as the father figure, and this results in the husband controlling her. The second one is that the girl finds it difficult to adjust to a new home. So she always longs for her paternal home. And because the bride is immature, most of the time she's unable to communicate properly with the husband, and therefore the husband seeks companionship outside the home. Akan girls also married after puberty, just like the Greek girls, but not necessarily to older men. I mean, most often they marry their age mates, but on few occasions they marry very old men. And the depiction of the place in the depiction of the marriages in the play shows that there's a high level of parity between the couples. And this gave the women were expected as matured, independent, and they took active part in their marriages. The contrast between these two wives, the Akan and the Athenian wives, is as a result of their dependency on their parents' house. So most often the training that they receive before they marry is different, and it reflects in their marriages. So the Akan girl is mostly free-spirited, can walk around, play with boys, but the Athenian girl is mostly restricted, and she over-depends on the father's family. The girl cannot contract the marriage by herself. It must be done by the family. But an Athenian girl had no say at all, and her consent wasn't needed when the father wanted to marry her off. But a Akan girl can initiate courtship or marriage on her own, with or without the approval of the parents, though society advised against doing it without your family's approval. Because of this, the plays depicted love and affection as very important roles in the contracting of marriage in Akan, in the Ghanaian place, but they played very little or no part in the Athenian marriages. Also, marriages were contracted based on to form alliances. So sometimes it was done because of financial and political reasons. When it comes to the dowry, the woman paid the dowry in the Greek society. So the essence was that the husband uses it to maintain her in the marriage until she divorces. The advantage is that it legitimizes the marriage and it shows compatibility between the couples, and the plays depict that a rich dowry attracted aristocratic husbands. Also, the dowry was the means for the girl to talk freely in her husband's home, and that is to avoid an inferior position. It also made it difficult for the man to divorce the wife, especially when the girl brought in a huge dowry and the man had no means of paying it back. The disadvantages is that the women from wealthy homes quickly get husbands, but those from poorer homes couldn't afford the dowry, so it makes it difficult to get husbands. Also, during warfare, when most of the men die at battle, there's an increase in widows and unmarried girls, and this affected fathers, because they have to find attractive dowries to trap the husbands for their daughters. Also, the dowry reveals the value men placed on women. So women were seen as burdens in society. So their maintenance was their father's responsibility and not that of their husbands, even after they are married. The Akans believe that the woman is very important in the society and that the would-be husband will benefit greatly from her services. Therefore, the dowry or the bride price was an appreciation for the family that trained the woman. So out of this, you can see that there's a huge difference in the marriage between the Akan and the Ghanaian girl. There is an expectation of a wife in each society, and a Greek wife is expected to stay indoors. So there's the belief that the more she goes out, the more she's prone to slander. She must also be discreet, must practice self-control, must be obedient, and must not be jealous of her husband's concubines. And examples provided in the plays are Andromache and Alcestis. And that's of the opposite, it's Medea and Hermione. The plays also depict that the women, the good ones, are those who support patriarchy and the subordination of women. And the bad women are those who question the inequalities in Athenian marriages. Akan women didn't have a specific sphere, so they could both enjoy the private and the public sphere. Some of them could even become kings or queens. The ideal wife in Akan society is supposed to procreate, and that was very important, raise children, and farm or trade to support the family. The plays depicted that there was no room for housewifery or idleness, and that the concept was very foreign to the Akan community. And a woman must farm or trade to fend for her family. When you compare these two women in each society, it depicts the common characteristics, and that is the woman must be loyal to her husband. She can't engage in any extramarital affairs. She must be obedient and can never challenge her husband's decisions. So Anoet's mother tells her that a good woman must not have a brain or a mouth. When it comes to divorce, in both societies, it wasn't respectable for the woman and it is frowned upon. But the Athenian woman couldn't even easily divorce her husband. When she must have a very good reason, and the good reason is to the Archon's decision to determine whether it's a good reason or not. He must have a male support and also an Archon. So the processes made it long and difficult for an Athenian wife to divorce. But the husband could just send her away with her dowry without reason or without resorting to the court. An Akan wife, however, can initiate divorce anytime she wants, just like the husband could. But it follows some processes, and the processes was equal for both the man and the woman. And it precedes reconciliation. So there's an attempt to reconcile them before the divorce is granted. When you compare these two plays, when you group the Greek plays together, it reveals that women were mostly handed on as property or as an inheritance. So in the case of Hoemon, Andromache, and Alcestis, they were Anna. It was an Anna that their fathers did for their husbands. So their husbands were victorious in battle, and therefore they gave their daughters as honor to these men, or as a means to an end. That's in the case of Medea. The place also reveals there's a complete dependency of the female on the male, and that in the contracting of marriage or in Athenian marriages, there were a lot of inequalities. The Ghanaian place, on the other hand, reveals that housewife is foreign to the Ghanaian community or to the Akan community, and it causes financial strain that leads to the dependency of the woman on the generosity of the man, which cemented male domination and female subordination in the home. It also reveals that the influence of colonization and patriarchy has taken effect in people's minds, and it has gradually erased the parity that women enjoyed in their marriages.
Stella, you have 1 minute.
Okay. It is not evident when you compare the plays that Euripides promotes equality in marriage, but confirms Athens' ideology about women and presents the patriarchal system as a way of protecting the woman. Unlike the Ghanaian plays that support traditional Akan marriages where there is parity, and it speaks against Western orientation of housewife and unquestionable support of the husband. That while the Greek play support on equal partnership in marriage, the Ghanaian play speak against it. I therefore argue that the women in traditional Akan societies had better, clearly defined place in traditional social relationships, which is absent in Athens, where the woman is an object in the struggle for space and power for men. Therefore, in gender relations, I do not believe the Greek plays serve as a literary inspiration for Ghanaian societies and its place. And as such, Ghana or Africa needs to reflect on its past for examples to address inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella, and for keeping time. I would like us to go to the next presenter, and that is Deus Kansime, who is going to present to us a paper entitled Poetry Nights as Spaces for Literary Activism, a Case of the Lantern Meet of Poets. Mr. Kansime, please make your presentation. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. I would like to approach the topic through the lens of literary activism. And for purposes of keeping time, I have left out my slides because they may not flow the way I expected. So allow me to present verbatim. Now, first of all, maybe I need to clarify what the Lantern Meet of Poets is or who they are. And basically, this is a network of poets. It's a group of poets who congregate, who have created this congregating space they call the Lantern Meet, where they come together to share poetry they have written by themselves, and they also form some kind of casual peer criticism that helps them to improve their work, to improve their craft of writing and performing poetry. But also this group has expanded to also include other forms of writing and other genres. So it is basically a club of poets. And I also would like to clarify what I mean by the poetry night. This is not necessarily a technical term, but it is just part of the jargon that the Lantern Meet of Poets used to describe their performances, their stage performances of poetry. And I look at these poetry nights in this presentation as a form, as an attempt to carry out literary activism. And I really want to understand literary activism through the lens of theorists like Muti Chanduri, who says that it is an attempt to create a productive fringe space for literary enterprise, one that is meant to remain on the margin and operate outside official protocols of the academia, but still hold value in terms of literary focus. And maybe I may also need to mention what Madhu Krisham says about such literary activist activities, that it's a set of activities aimed at opening spaces for literary production and consumption outside the mainstream and the domineering global machine of literary production, consumption, and appraisal. So this is a kind of rebel or fringe space that is meant to give opportunity for literary production and also create new circuits of value. I want to locate this effort in a form of inertia that exists in the last has existed in the last 2 or 2.5 decades in the publishing industry, and in some cases the academic institutions, which historically were always the incubation spaces for new writers, for new publications, and because there is some kind of inertia, which of course there are many factors. You can talk of the structure adjustment programs, and also the post-Cold War environment, which really showed the triumph of free markets. And so publishing houses have increasingly looked at the commercial value of a literary product much more intensely than the context of the 1960s and 1970s, where there was even state investment in cultural products, including literary production. So now publishers want to look at the market value of a book, and that creates, it locks out many of the young emerging writers. And the reaction to this set of circumstances is to create congregating spaces outside the mainstream. And this entire effort, I would like to read it as a form of literary activism through the lens of literary activist theories. And one of the ways the East African writers, these new upcoming writers in this region of East Africa and in Uganda in particular, was they responded by, writers of this category responded by creating, using literally what Doreen Strauss calls literary NGOs, and this lingo framework where the Lantern Meet of Poets can be located as a way of forming spaces where literature that cannot be easily accessed, or that literature that cannot easily access the mainstream publishing and also mainstream academia, uses NGOs which are designed like any other NGOs, but their focus is on literary production, even training writers, and doing really the work that literature departments and publishing houses used to do in the 1960s and 1970s. So this lingo framework is what these literary organizations like Lantern Meet are using. And now, how do these poetry nights function as major platforms for literary activism in the case of Lantern Meet? Because the Lantern Meet is primarily a group of poets, they feel that the book is not enough to reach the publics they want to reach. So they use the stage performance as if it were a certain page using a different medium. And therefore, their effort to really revolutionize the stage, to look at the stage as a form of publishing, performance as a form of publishing, using other media and not the page, is a very interesting idea that I feel is an effort at literary activism. And what do these performances, these poetry nights do? First of all, they help these fringe writers, these fringe poets to mobilize audiences, which they may not be able to access if they don't go through mainstream publishing. Then they also create new networks of circulation. They even, it's a form of like Ngugi's moving the center. They are trying to move the center from the publishing and the publishing, mainstream publishing industry to these congregating spaces like the Lantern Mill of Poets to be able to give this fringe peripheral expression of literary endeavors. And the other thing that they do that happens in these poetry nights is that they help these writers to be able also to market their own products, like books they have printed through their own publishing streams, which are also an interesting, form of dodging the mainstream publishing. And Lantern Meat is doing really what is more familiar is the Femrite. What Femrite has done since the 1990s is also similar to what the Lantern Meet of Poets is doing. And of course, like Doreen Strauss says, these are now the new spaces for incubating new writers. And like Dosrin Kiguru adds, that they also become spaces for forming new canons, creating new circuits of value that may not be familiar with the already established mainstream. So let me conclude by highlighting and outlining some of the points that I made. One is that the Poetry Night is an expression of literary activism. It's an attempt at campaigning for a certain marginal literature. Two, the Poetry Night is the organization bears some primary agency in the production, dissemination, and consumption of literary products from these poets and other writers who are associated with the Lantern Meet. Then the Poetry Night is a tool to generate, mobilize, and consolidate particular publics and audiences. The Poetry Night activities also are conditioned by other larger contexts, like the global movement of literary activism. But also, if you look closer, you see this whole movement of slam poetry, the global wave of stage poetry, and even the oral culture in the region. The oral tradition also influences the way these poetry nights work and how they are more important in reaching out to publics that these writers want to access. And then the performance is seen as a medium to negotiate space for this marginal position of literature being produced by the Lantern Meet. And that the literary products of the Lantern Meet are a good fit also for the circuits of value that seem to pervade the present day ecosystem of the arts in the region. Thank you very much. And thank you, Isaac.
Thank you, Dos, for your presentation on literary activism. And colleagues, if you have any question that you would like to ask, I'm going to request that you please put it in the chat section so that we'll read it out and also have as many questions as we can have for this session. Thank you very much. So we're going to open up for questions, and I'm going to start with okay, I need to look at this. Michael, Dr. Chiguli says, Michael, this is done very carefully and systematically. So in analyzing the narrative time, do you link it to focalization and the relationship between narration and time in order to see how story, narrator, and narration function for achieving the texture of the story? That is for Michael Balitumye. For Stella, this is a fascinating study and insightful. Why did you compare Greek and Ghanaian drama? What are the central devices that helped you to get to your insights? Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, what are the central dramatic devices that helped you get to your insights? And then for Dose, I hope Dose in your paper, you give a careful overview of the history and the constant evolution of the lantern myth before you do the specific analysis. Where did the lantern myth of poets come from? E.g., where were the first graduates that were part of this group from? And what's the morphology of this poetry night as used by lantern myths of poets? Were there, and were there, especially at the beginning, other poetry nights in other groups? And I also asked Dose, how effective is literary activism in our literary space in Uganda? And is it able to achieve its goals within the Ugandan literary space? If there's any other question, I'm going to give Michael and Dose a chance to respond, and then we will have another. Is Michael in the room?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Room?
I was saying that I am here.
Yes, I can now hear you.
Okay, to thank Doctor for the question. I hadn't given much attention to focalization. I think I should. I just want to observe that Oshinyo both uses especially the zero focalizer or omniscient narrator, and that sort of gives him leeway to play around with the structure of time. But I must admit, I've not, in specifically analyzing this paper, I didn't give enough attention to focalization. I agree with Doctor that if I gave it quite good attention, it would help in bringing the contrast between narrator, narration, and also story. I should be able to do more work around that. Thank you. Hello? Isaac, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Thank you, Michael, for your responses. And yes, I can hear you very I can hear you very well. Is still in the room?
Yes, I'm here. Hello. I think the internet is bad. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Stella, please respond. Please respond to your question. Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Susan. 2 questions. Why I chose the Greek and Ghana. When you look at African societies, like when you look at the universities in Africa, not many of them read classics. I'll use my own university as an example. Hello? Can you hear me, please?
We can hear you.
Yes,
okay.
Stella, I can hear you. Stella, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'll use my own university as an example. So most of the scholarly writings by our senior colleagues are towards what we learn from the classics. What we learn from the classics. That is a question that is most papers try to address. And I try to think about it, if classics were to be a contemporary society, what can the Greek or the Roman society also learn from Africa? And that is where I take it from. And where do I start from, if not my country? The other thing is that there are adaptations of the classics. One I used by Efua Sutherland of Edufa from their orchestras. And it was a good way to start this research by looking at the representation of women in both places, and how our past, the pre-colonial gender equality that women enjoyed, can influence contemporary society. So that is the reason why I chose the Greek and Ghana. The second question is the use of dramatic devices. So if you look at the plays, especially the Greek plays, not all of them present women as downtrodden. The plays also present women like Medea and Hekabe as forceful women who challenge the authority of men. So the contrast was very important. Contrast, paradox, and antithesis were central to the discussion of the work. Then also the use of rhetoric was very important, because it is through the speeches, it is through the monologues, the soliloquy, the arguments that in Greek we call it agon, between the characters, that also brings out the perception or the ideas that they have about society's inequalities or gender parity. Also, rhetoric was important because it gives you a clue of the stand of the writer himself on the central issues he addresses in the plays. There was also the necessity for me to look at the chorus perception, because the chorus represent the society, so they are the middleman, let me put it that way, or middleman between the audience and the characters. So where their sympathy lies was also very important, and to tell you about the playwright's idea about what he was writing. So the chorus and characterization, how did the playwright depict the characters, was also very useful. There were also some other rhetoric dramatic devices like symbolism and other things that I used to arrive at my conclusion in the article. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to respond to one, is that what is the evolution and the brief overview of the evolution of the lantern myth. I think this is a very important question that I also did not address because of my fear for the time. But the lantern myth starts as a grassroots movement at Makerere University. You have 4 university first-year students who come to Makerere. None of them is doing literature as their course, and so they like to share poetry. They like to write poetry. It is something I think they came with from high school, and this is around 2007. And what these poets do, the first four core, they meet in a certain hall of residence, Africa Hall, and then they start to share their poetry, and this becomes a culture. It becomes a tradition. And there was this element of them sitting in a circle, and they have like a candle. Usually there would be power cuts those days, around 2007. So there's a candle, and so that is where the term lantern meets. So the idea of a lantern meeting around the lantern to share poetry. So that is how the thing started, but then it later grew in membership, and they even migrated from using the hall of residence as their core place for meeting. They went and sought space at the Uganda Cultural Center, at the National Museum, the National Theatre, and then they started even doing stage performances. From then they kept scaling. So they have had an evolution of moving from a grassroots students movement to incorporate many other people, and then going to the National Theatre. And then later they even thought that the National Theatre is limiting in a way, and they started getting out of the National Theatre and doing poetry performances in bars, in spaces outside. Really, the whole concept of literary activism, of going to the fringe, going to the periphery, is what informed their choice of even leaving the National Theatre as their major space of action. But now they have grown into a fully-fledged lingo, fully-fledged organization with any strategic plan, with offices, and they do training for performers, for poets, for writers of fiction, and other things. So that is how the Lantern Meet has grown. It even has opened up a publishing arm called Ibua. I hope that really answers Dr. Chiguri's question. And also, I think that responds to what I see as, the morphology of this poetry night as used. So yes, the morphology of it is really, like I said, first of all, the performance, depending on how they have scripted their cast, their production. Maybe I also need to mention that what they perform is their poetry. So you write a poem, and then they get someone else to perform it for you. Or sometimes they can even ask you to perform your own poetry. And of course, people pay tickets to come and watch the poetry, and they have the capacity to fill an entire auditorium of the theater. So then there is also the question on how effective is literary activism in our literary space in Uganda. I think it is, if we understand literary activism, maybe let me first describe in simple terms what literary activism is as a concept, because it's also a question that has been raised here, that literary activism has two broad interpretations. The first could be looked at as activism in literature, and activism in literature as opposed to activism for literature is that some people use literary works to do activism for other ideals. It could be gender equality, it could be social justice issues, the LGBT rights. So where you use the literature as a platform, you write a poem or you write a book, a novel or a play to campaign for a particular idea. It could be, all these social justice issues that usually come from activist circles. That is one interpretation. But there is another interpretation, which is activism for a particular form of literature, a marginal literature. And this is the kind of interpretation that I leaned on, the one that is described by Amuti Chanduri and Krishna, who call it an attempt to create a fringe space, to give platform to this fringe space in order to even circumvent, to find a way around the hard walls, the very thick walls of the mainstream publishing and also mainstream academia, which tends to have, in their opinion, they tend to look at these two established, these two forms of the establishment of the mainstream as having a strong hubris that may not be receptive to new writers who have different canons and different ways of, determining literary value. So that is maybe what I can describe as literary activism. So how effective is it? I think it is a very effective, looking at it from the second interpretation, is a very effective form. And I think one example of that effectiveness is if we look at FemRight, which is very familiar, which most people are familiar with. I think the success of FemRight become a strong publishing force, but also a force for giving platform to emerging writers, especially the female writers. For me, the success of FemRight is really a success at this attempt at literary activism. Of course, none of these organizations will define themselves when they are describing themselves as, we are literary activists. But what they do is actually an attempt, an endeavor at literary activism. So similarly, these poets and these other groups. There are many we could mention, Chitara Nation, London Meet of Poets, and there are other subsidiary organizations. All those are really there on the ground, especially in most of these urban spaces. They're doing a great deal of producing new writers. Yes, they may not have reached a point where they can have a very stable canon, but they are doing a lot of literary enterprise out there. And I think it has some influence, especially if you understand it through the legal framework that Doreen Strauss articulates. Thank you. I hope I was able to respond to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dos. Dr. Navulia, you have a question. What is the difference between rhetoric and dialogue? And I think this was not for Dr. Navulia. What's the difference between rhetoric and dialogue, and what do we really have in the plays? But this is just for you to think about. Okay, this should have been this should have been.
I guess that's me.
Okay. Then think about the setting where they started. Please, if you can interview the first group of Lantern Meet of Poets, and how did the graduates from literature, the first ones like Laura, get to join? Just think about this, not answering. Eve Navulia says there is also literary activism in reference to works that narrate stories about activist ventures. I wonder if there is. Okay, Dr. Chiguli says, thank you, Dos. You have the opportunity to archive as accurately? Yes, archive as accurately as possible. Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes, and I wonder if there is any other question. Yes, Lillian Babazi asks, would you refer to the Lantern Meet of Poets as youth activism? What are the ages of the participants? Yes, Dos.
Well, I would, in a way, refer to it as youth activism, because definitely the age bracket, at least for most of the membership, is that of youth. Of course, the initial members have now outgrown the youth stage. Those who were youth in 2007, and some of them like Ojaka, then there's another one called Guy Mambo. Those were people in the first circle of the four. They are out of the ambit of youth, but really the kind of activism that was being done was that of a youth group. And the Lantern Meet of Poets is really a youth outfit. Although what they're doing is not necessarily youth activism for the role of youth in literature. No, that's not exactly what they're doing. What they're doing is activism as a form of giving voice to the kind of literary production and literary enterprise that is happening in this fringe space of upcoming writers who also happen to be young. So that is how I would really respond to your question. Yes, the age bracket is that of youth. You could call it youth activism in a way, but the activism is not really so much about them being youth and being given space, but giving space to upcoming writers, so to speak. I would rather use the word upcoming writers than look at them. But then, of course, there are also Lantern Meet poets or writers associated with the Lantern Meet that are way older, who joined the Lantern Meet and are older than this bracket. Thank you.
Thank you, Dos, for that. So, do such writers grow to become mainstream, and can you name any? I think this conversation is going to have to continue. Thank you, everyone who has been part of this panel and part of the attendees that have joined us during this session. I would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you to Eve Navulia, to Michael Balitumie, Dos Kansime, and Stella Antwiwa. And thank you to everyone who has made this a special moment for all of us to be part of this. And thank you, our host. And I wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.